one commitment you have to have is to listen, and then the other is to evolve.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. So here's my story. Last week, I did my first facilitation post-COVID. So I've done a couple like virtual facilitations. I did a strategic planning, and those have had their own challenges trying to do that sort of thing virtually with trying to make shared visuals with shared screens and all that kind of stuff. So that has absolutely been challenging. But this past week, I did my first ever in-person facilitation, and they were going to be about, no, you're like, I don't understand. In person.
In person.
Yeah, there are so many layers to this that we could tackle because it like I have enough to think about when I'm going to do a facilitation with a group of people. This added 47 umpteen layers that I'd never had to think about before. And it was just kind of mind-bending actually, but I also think it's a little bit of a preview to some of the things that we have to think about. As I was walking in, I was like, I might be one of the first people to be doing like a workshop-y facilitation in this environment. And
did you have a Neil Armstrong quote prepared?
Almost.
I walk into the boardroom.
Notes from the trenches. So it was really interesting. I mean, there were a couple quick layers. There were going to be 12 of us, and actually a couple ended up not being able to come. So we were even only like 9 or 10. So that was helpful. But it was going to be outside because they have a big patio deck kind of thing. But then of course it rained. So we had to move it inside. So immediately right away, my concern came up because as a facilitator, especially, I think anytime you're hosting a meeting, people probably feel this way, but especially as a facilitator, I'm always thinking about everyone's, I don't mean comfort, like, is your chair mushy enough, but ease, like, do they feel comfortable being in the space to have the conversation? Normally it's things like, do they feel outnumbered if there's any kind of contention on the topic or, like those kinds of things. But in this case, my immediate concern was, wow, if someone agreed to come because it was going to be outside and they felt safe with that, do they now not feel comfortable, but they feel peer pressured or, they feel like they can't say no or they're hesitating to say no. So that was already, and if somebody's there feeling, antsy and dodgy, that is not going to exactly bring out their most creative, nuanced thinking for these kinds of things. So that was my first concern. So as I got closer and I knew that was going to be the case, here were some of my other concerns. I wasn't sure people would be able to see what I wrote on the whiteboard. Like, can I write large enough on the whiteboard that they'll be able to see?
Oh, because you've got 9 or 10 people social distanced.
Correct. And because I wasn't sure whether I knew what the space looked like, but until I got there, I wasn't confident about how far people should be spread, like left to right versus back, and what that would mean. Because anyway, I could see that going either way. And if you're too far to one side, you can't see. And if you're too far back, you can't see. And that actually ended up being not so bad. Handy tip, little note that I remembered from my architecture days: standard ceiling tiles are 2 by 2.
Yeah.
So every 3 ceiling tiles, if ever you're someplace and you're feeling, uneasy or you're not sure how far 6 feet is, if it's a standard ceiling tile place, you can kind of see where that is.
Squares are 4 by 2, but I get the point. That's how I measure rooms. Yeah,
exactly.
They're 4 by 2. Yeah.
Exactly. So, so we got that down, and so that was okay with that. But because I wasn't sure if people would be able to see the things, I also thought, for these couple of components that are really important and I want them, and there are things that are already generated in advance, I'm going to go ahead and make handouts. So I printed out the handouts so that if someone couldn't see, they could see these initial things, and which were like review of what had been discussed before. And then as I got there, I was like, oh, I can't just pass these out. Like if in the moment,
Yeah, some people would feel uncomfortable with that. Yeah.
The person I hand them to might be fine, but then they might pass them to someone who's like, I don't want to touch that. And then we'd have this weird thing about like, well, can you pass them on to the next person or whatever? So I laid them out on their desks with a little sticky that said, not yet, because I didn't want them turning them over until it was that part of the discussion. And interestingly, some people didn't touch those either, and they didn't need them because they could see them. So I don't know if that was discomfort, but point being, and let's not even worry about the part, because this part won't really stretch over into things people who aren't facilitators have to think about. But every single strategy I have so that a 4-hour meeting isn't boring, where people are just sitting in a space almost like a classroom, we couldn't do. So like, and also they're not just for that purpose. They're also to like surface thoughts from more than just the people who will chime in with their every thought. So we couldn't break down into small groups where you discussed a thing and then like shared each group's thought. We couldn't gather in small groups. There's a couple stickies exercises that I do to kind of make the brainstorming work. I didn't think people would feel comfortable with that and how that would work. So it was pretty paralyzing in terms of what my choices were. But
well, the other thing I believe, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also hard to ask the group, would you feel comfortable? Because people, like to your point about somebody feeling outnumbered,
yes.
You don't want to be that guy who really does feel uncomfortable, but doesn't want to raise their hand and say, well, I don't want to touch this sticky, because that's really super awkward.
And that was my entire come from, is that I was trying hard to not ask anyone to do anything that they were uncomfortable with, and also not gauge in the moment by some sort of survey or raise of hands, whether I was opting towards the lowest level of making somebody feel uncomfortable. And I will say, it's not like that is the state of the world forever and ever. There's a lot of unknowns that I think will become a little bit more known-ish as we go ahead. Like some of this stuff will start to kind of pare down, I think. But in trying to think of every possible awkward situation that I might put someone in, it really did paint me into a very tiny corner of what I could do. And then one more thing that was really telling and really surprising, I didn't see this coming, is because we were inside, we all wore masks because we're going to be inside for 4 hours. That's a long time. And I'm talking. So I knew I was going to wear a mask no matter what, even if other people felt comfortable not wearing them, because I didn't want to make someone else uncomfortable. And guess what? There is actually an enormous amount of human emotion and thought and communication that happens more with the mouth than you can possibly, and I don't mean verbs, words. Like watching people's eyes is helpful, but so much of the interpretation of whether they meant that in a teasing way or a snarky way, or if they're bored, or if they're frustrated, or if they're fill in the blank with 9 other varieties of how someone might mean the same set of words they just said. And it boiled down to this. I think the eyes kind of indicate intensity of a feeling, but the mouth is where you really see whether somebody says something and they're like, or if they're like, like this kind of like, I don't know, it's very much a visual, but which is kind of the point. So, but the important thing about that was communicating in a nuanced way with masks is really hard. There's absolutely some gaps there.
No, there absolutely would be. It's funny because I go back to the images, the old time images of a bank robber, right? Or the Lone Ranger. Anytime you wanted to hide your identity, you have something over your eyes and people can't tell who you are. Like Clark Kent wearing glasses. Oh, I don't know who this person is, because it's covering his eyes. But at the same time, and so that might be a way to really recognize somebody. But I do believe people are a lot more expressive very often with their mouth or the jaw or whatever than they are with their eyes, because you can tell, and sometimes it's the composite, because you can tell when people are smiling but not with their eyes.
Yes. Yes.
right? And so if there's a disconnect between the two, that really tells you something,
And that's kind of what I meant with the intensity, like a full out. If somebody's truly full out smiling, you see it in their eyes. So you get that. If they're kind of giving a polite smile, their eyes look pretty dead. And so
or if there's a smile of just recognition, it's not like laughing at a joke, but they smile, they recognize the situation you're talking about, whatever. That doesn't necessarily travel all the way to the eyes, in terms of that intensity of emotion. So
exactly. And so there was, and there's a kind of like the smirky smile that's really not meant as a smile, that's meant, more in a snarky way. That doesn't really make it, the snark doesn't make it to the eyes. Like you kind of need to see that the snark smiled, or I don't even mean snark, but just kind of harumphy, sort of like, somebody disagrees with what is said.
But I will tell you that, and I've had conversations with people who are wearing masks, and I'll make more of an effort to do things that I hadn't done before. Like I'll nod more when before hadn't done that. Or so there is an effort to compensate.
Well, and one of those ways that was also kind of, I won't say unnerving, but it's just because you have to, you really can't not make eye contact. More like, which I'm not someone who avoids eye contact, at least I don't think I do. So I'm kind of surprised to be making that statement, but it is your only vehicle other than the words that you're hearing to be, so you really do have to more kind of stare at people's eyes versus like fleeting eye contact with a little bit of like looking around. It's not unlike watching a movie with subtitles, where, unless you speak the language, you can't like look at your phone for a couple minutes. You can't, kind of wander into the kitchen to get a drink while you're still listening to the movie. You really have to stay there and eyeball the screen. And it felt a tiny bit like that. That's not to say that there weren't plenty of moments where I didn't need to be like directly reading someone's eyes. It doesn't work like that. But in the moments where I needed to get a beat on someone, beyond just what words they were using, you really do have to kind of stare them down to try and read what's going on.
But what I'm also interested in, and I want to make sure we don't get away from, is you're talking about the different rules, whether it's the stickies or the handouts and who touches what. And I'll tell you, I've seen that. So you had your facilitation on Friday. I had the first time I actually sat down with people from my firm. There were just 4 of us in the patio of a restaurant in Hunt Valley. First time I had gotten together with, and sat down, had a conversation with somebody outside of my family in months. And so we were at the Iron Rooster in Hunt Valley, and they did a really good job of laying out all their rules. Everything is disposable, and they said, take this menu that's outside and we're going to just throw it away. Everybody buses their own tables. And anyway, but you notice there are certain things when I thought, well, that seems to be a little over the top. So for example, when the meal came to an end, we had coffee. So they brought sugar in a it looked like, a cup of soup, the paper container. So they put sugar packets in there. So they had a variety of sweet and low and whatever, and sugar, but the packets that were left over, they threw out.
Oh my goodness.
Right. Because I guess if somebody's thumbing through the packets, you touch it or whatever. And I will tell you that part of me reverted to being like an 80-year-old grandmother. Well, if I had known you were throwing out the packets, maybe I should have put them in my pocket to take them home. But anyway, so I had that, but then the menus that we had, we said, should we throw these out? And she was like, no, I'll just take them back to whatever. So we're like, okay, that's fine. I mean, because I tend not to worry about, did other people rifle through the menus and touch this or whatever.
Sure.
Maybe I'm foolish for doing that. But I've noticed that certain things aren't as well thought out. I'll give you one more example. I stopped into my office over the weekend, and they had put on the door of the restroom 4 like these brackets so that you could open the door with your forearm. You can insert your forearm and all that.
I've
And I
seen like
thought, well,
foot
that's,
versions of those things, like to
yeah.
like pull.
But here's the thing. If you've ever had an experience where you're leaving the restroom and somebody's coming in and you have one of these things, if you put your forearm there and somebody pushes the door, you can snap your arm. I mean, it's this big, it's not just this little hook. It's this thing that's
Right.
going to immobilize 6 inches of your forearm.
Right.
So, so I'm not sure that's all that well thought out, but I like the spirit of it.
Right. Yeah,
You know?
it is this it reminds me of this story that my mom loves to tell of I was in high school and I had painted my nails, which in and of itself is a story of note because I think I've probably painted my own fingernails like 10 times in my life. But I'd painted my nails, but we had to go to school and it was time to leave and they weren't dry yet. And so I very carefully, you know, like with the tipsies of my fingers, like picked up my coat and I pulled my fingers in and carefully slid it through my coat so that I managed to get, you know, one arm through and didn't mess up my nails. And then I gingerly pulled up this time. It was just this very like, you know, what's it called with diffusing a bomb kind of like careful precision to get and I got my coat all the way on. And then she said she watched from a distance as I very carefully reached into the very edge of my pocket and pulled out my glove and then very carefully slid my hand into the glove. And she said, like, as those last few seconds, she said she just watched like the recognition come over my face of this like careful sliding into the glove. And it, to me, I've thought of that so many times in the past few months because it's like when you try to think of everything, you can't think of everything. And you don't have to. I mean, like it's not, you know, I think we're all going to start to realize that, you know, there are levels. I just read this fantastic article about how to hug in a pandemic. Like they're starting to break it down into, okay, you know, if you're going to go out to a restaurant, these are the things that matter. These are the things that probably don't matter. Will you remain at 100% safety? No, but that's the point. You don't necessarily have to. Whereas like, don't use your friend's fork to eat your food, you know,
Right.
Not that you'd have done that anyway, but I was trying to think of something, you know, egregiously germy, but you know, I think as we start to
people do share to that point though, people do share desserts,
right,
or they'll, you know,
Yep.
Oh, you have to taste this or whatever. So there are levels of contact.
Yes, that are probably less wise than they used to be. But you know, but between your sugar packets and the menu, that is pretty funny. You're like, how are those the same but different? Right. I don't think that's the same. Well, especially because you know someone touched the menu. It was a menu that somebody held an order from, whereas like people might have touched the sugar packets and they get tossed.
You have no idea.
Yeah, it's I think, I mean, we have a lot to figure out. And I think what was interesting to me about it and why I wanted to bring it up is that not as some sort of compendium on here's what you do and what you have to think about, but just this awareness that we don't even know yet what's going to be different. We keep imagining going back and doing things like we used to as if we'll be doing all the same things in just with a mask on or from a few feet apart. And I think we're going to quickly realize how much more there is than that. I mean, another kind of sort of silly thing is I think I might be like I won't say I'm a tiny bit deaf, but I definitely have a little bit more trouble hearing than I think I do because I think I read lips a tiny bit. Like I don't full out read lips, but without the benefit of someone's mouth that I think I watch when they talk, I had a harder time hearing. Now that might have also been because of the mask, you know, muffling their voice a tiny bit. But I think I also watch people's faces. So I think it's going to be fascinating as we start interacting with one another and doing some of the things.
But one of the things that really shouldn't get lost is you had brought up with the facilitation that some people didn't come. Maybe they didn't come because they just couldn't make it schedule-wise, or maybe they didn't come because they didn't feel safe. But either way, you had less than 100% attendance. And some people decided that they weren't going to touch the handouts, and other people decided that they were, and that's fine. But in both of those examples, at least my takeaway is that there's an even playing field, that I have the right to make that decision for myself. But in an employer-employee situation, there's
Right.
often not an equal playing field, because
This
you're
is
saying
correct.
to employees in many facets, you don't have
Mm-hmm.
the right to decide. I'm laying down the policies, and this is what you have to do. And we will pick up the handouts, I guess, in that example, or you will attend this meeting,
Yep.
because this is a mandatory meeting.
Yeah, no, I've heard some nightmare stories about that. There was a post going around here in Baltimore about a server who was saying that she didn't feel safe with the way her restaurant was doing it.
Right.
And it was a very cut and dry response from ownership of like, you show up and you do it this way, or you're off, and no more and they were going to push back on allowing her to get unemployment from them. It was just very clear, if you do this, then we're going to say you refuse to work, and that, and so, yeah, it brings up a really important point that I have had to have several conversations with a few clients about, because I don't think these are people who don't run their company in a command and control kind of way. They're not power mongers. They're not my way or the highway kind of people. And so therefore they're not in the practice of really in an intricate way thinking about power dynamics, because it's just not how they are as humans. So, but I think that awareness that, like it or not, and whether or not you wield it regularly or not, you have a higher level. There are these power structures, and if people work for you, they are going to feel compelled to do the things, like, even if you're not, I'm sort of saying this backwards. That practice that I went through of trying to make sure that I didn't put someone in a position where they had to decide whether they felt comfortable speaking up is the opposite of what, because if you're the conversation I've had to have with a couple clients is where they're like, well, we'll just, we're going to come in and, I'm not going to be wearing a mask, but, blah, 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 blah. But people are free to, we'll put in there, the thing says, wear a mask, like blah, 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 blah. I said, yeah, but you don't realize that by you not wearing one, that says to people that you don't think it's important. And the same is if you do, and because you are the boss, then that power dynamic comes into play. It makes a statement.
Right. I mean, so if the boss isn't wearing one,
Mm-hmm.
then, and this may be a male-female thing, but I will tell you from my point of view, the way I would have looked at it in that situation is, if my boss isn't wearing one, then am I projecting weakness
Mm-hmm.
by wearing a mask? Or am I implicitly questioning my boss's judgment?
Mm-hmm.
Or making a statement that he or she should be more sensitive to the needs of others? I mean, there's this whole unspoken dialogue that would go on in my head. We've talked about, as a boss or as an employer, sending out a Facebook friend request, and that unspoken dialogue to an employee. Do I have to accept it? It's not an even playing field. Well, here it's the same thing about following the examples
Mm-hmm.
of what's been said. It's interesting to me, in the headlines, Trump is going to be having this rally in Oklahoma,
Mm-hmm.
and he's not going to be wearing a mask. But they interviewed one of the senators from Oklahoma, who said he's been wearing a mask everywhere, but now he has to decide if he's going to wear a mask at this gathering, and if so, how he does it, and when he's in the presence of the president. And there was this whole dialogue that he put into words about, well, wait a minute, am I sending the wrong signal or doing something, or questioning judgment? And I think that's very...
Yeah. Well, you bring up a whole other level to this that is just so unfortunate, which is that in addition to the varying perceptions and concerns that people have about the virus itself, so in and of itself, that would already create this dynamic that we're talking about, where people people are having to judge because there isn't this super, super clear, if you do exactly this, you'll be fine. So people are constantly having to say like, is this like too much, too little? How do I feel about this particular set of variables that are all in one? I would stand outside in a somewhat spread out triangle talking to people and not feel like I have to have a mask on, but we're inside.
Right.
And even if it's only 5 minutes, is that too much, too little? I think I'll leave my mask on, whatever. So figuring those things out anyway. But there's this other layer where it has been so politicized as to not just what statement you're making about the health safety, but there is this perception that now it's a t-shirt for some people about how you feel about political things. And so there will be this added layer of someone who feels, a friend of mine actually got screamed at in a store for wearing a mask by a guy which is
Really?
which he was, something about take off that stupid, what did he say? I think he said communist mask, you sheeple.
Was it
like,
in fact
oh,
a
now we're
communist
bringing
mask? Did it have a hammer and sickle in it?
It's not communist mask, but whatever, like that extra layer of whatever that is going to make it even. So if you're an employer and you have somebody in your staff who not only has just decided that they don't feel like they need to wear one from a health standpoint, which is already problematic because it's not just about them, it can make other people really nervous. But then if they're really coming at it with this strong-fisted perception of what that means, either way, it's just a whole other layer of complication.
Yeah, and we've seen, just walking into the grocery store, we've seen I can't say we've seen the judgment coming from other people, but we've perceived the judgment, and maybe wrongfully, because in where we live, which is deeply Republican territory, first of all, there's the discussion that we have that a pandemic is political in and of itself, is troublesome. But when you go into the grocery store and you see some people defiantly not wearing a mask, and they look to me like they're daring people, to say something, and then people wearing a mask, and are those people judging the non-mask people? And it's the whole dynamic in society, and that becomes even trickier when you're not bound together just by happenstance of shopping in the same place at the same time. You're bound together because you're working for the same organization, and you have to attend some of the same events, and you have to handle some of the same materials. And I do think the challenge for business is not just coming up with procedures, but determining which are the commandments, the thou shalt and the thou shalt nots.
Yes.
Because I will tell you, when I started a law firm with some friends, we originally had joked about the fact that, we're all friends and we're going to run it like Outback Steakhouse. No rules, just right. That's what we said. No rules, just right. You want to come in at 11? That's fine. Just get this done, whatever. And we discovered, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
There are some rules, and navigating those rules here, I think, is one of the trickiest challenges we've had in a business generation.
100%, because it's not just, there aren't a lot of knowns. So how do you put rules around unknowns? And you have to think about people's, I was sitting there while we were doing this facilitation, and, I kept thinking about the fact, like, if I have to think about, if there are one or two people who really weren't sure, they felt comfortable coming, but did. So they're coming in with like this tiny bit of like, am I going to regret this? Which I'll be honest, I in no way felt pressured to say yes to facilitating it. I thought it through. I decided I was okay with it, but I still had just enough remaining doubt. And that was how I kept saying it. I was like, I don't feel pressure to come. I'm here because I have decided that I will come and do this. But I just have just enough lingering that I'm like, I wonder if I'm really going to regret this in a couple of weeks. Is this like what, because you don't know until after the fact. So you don't have, so if somebody there was feeling a little bit like, that was the other thing too. This is super important. We're all going to be asked to make these decisions about whether we feel comfortable going to a thing. Like everybody in your company decided they felt comfortable meeting for that coffee. And we think it through, we make our decisions. Let's pretend there's none of the power dynamics where Lacey felt like she had to say yes because you brought it up. Like, let's say that's all
Right.
clean. It occurred to me that there may be people in that room who went to get dressed that morning, which, by the way, could be a whole other episode because I forgot that I would have to put on like real clothes. And I'm like, where are my real shoes? Like,
Exactly.
It's like, do I have a dress? Do I own clothes? I guess I can't wear sweatpants. Like, so that's a thing. But there may be people who are getting dressed or who got in their car, or as they walked out of the elevator, suddenly just felt this like layer of anxiety land on them, because sometimes it's not, you think you're fine about a thing, and then you walk in, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling anxious about this. I'm unsure. You can't forget that just because somebody said they felt good about it doesn't mean they have remained feeling good about it. So it feels like it needs this hyper emotional awareness of just, and not in an annoying way, like, you okay? Are you okay? You okay?
But I think what has to happen though is that business owners, particularly as an employer, you have to be aware that whatever you come up with, yes, there may be some rules, but I think you have to convey that those aren't the rules from now until the end of time.
Yes.
That you have a commitment to listen and a commitment to reevaluate, so that if somebody is not comfortable with the rule as it stands today, at least they know they haven't missed their opportunity to be heard, and that there will be an opportunity to be heard because you recognize the need to evolve with the situation. I think that's the best you can do.
I think we're going to have to, because imagine if like everything's running super, super smoothly. Let's say you and your something as innocuous as the 4 or 5 of you getting together for that meal once a week, and you all feel really, really great about it. Well, between now and next week, Lacey goes somewhere for spring break and she's jammed on a beach with 500 people, and you've seen pictures of her on Facebook partying, that whatever. And the next week, what is the mechanism by which someone in your company can be like, I don't want to sit at a table with Lacey for the next couple of weeks.
And we didn't have, right. So that's a personal thing. In your example, Lacey, I don't want to sit with Lacey, but we do have at least one person in the firm that doesn't want to come out for coffee and doesn't. Mm-hmm. Because they feel that they're immunocompromised or what have you, and they don't, and that's fine. I just think you have the one commitment you have to have is to listen, and then the other is to evolve. So I guess and that's it.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.